This is Dan MacDonald of the Historical Association of East Kootenay, interviewing Mrs. Falconer of Cranbrook, formerly of Fort Steele. Mrs. Falconer's maiden name was Tannhauser. The Tannhausers were one of the early pioneer families of Fort Steele. Mrs. Falconer, your people came from the American Midwest?
They came from Minnesota into Montana, where they resided for ever so many years, and then took this homestead near Kalispell. And the family had to remain on it until they proved up. And about that time, there was the gold rush in B.C., and my father came to Fort Steele in May 1897.
Well.
And the family, part of our family, came up in the fall. That would have been in September, about the second week in September, because school was open then. We were late entering school.
Now, before coming to Fort Steele, your people would possibly travel on the railroad that was just about built or just being completed. Would that be the Great Northern? Could you tell us?
I think it was the Great Northern that went. I think that was the first train that was built from the east to the west.
And possibly about the first trip or two that it would make? Or
yes, my father came first on the freight train. He'd been very ill, and he came out on the freight train. And then that same year, the family came out on the first passenger train, which they call an excursion train.
Well.
And that would have been around I just know what year, perhaps around 1886,
I would think so, yes.
About 3 years old, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, you resided in Montana, didn't you, for a while before?
Yes, went to school in Great Falls, and then latterly, when we were on the homestead, we went to the summer school.
Where was the homestead in Montana?
About 5 miles from Columbia Falls, 14 miles from Kalispell, and about 3 miles from what they call Whitefish now, the Whitefish Lake.
Be nice to go back and see that, wouldn't it?
I'd like to.
You have no knowledge of whatever happened to the home place, the homestead, or some place?
No, I've never been back. I think it was timbered. Everything was timbered through there, you know, and they said, I know years after, said I wouldn't know the place, nor would I.
No.
Because it's all, I suppose, highways and that sort of thing.
I suppose, yeah. Now, you mentioned the gold strike, or the gold fever in British Columbia. Did that attract your family?
Brought my father up, yes. He came up with some friends. They were going to Rossland first. That was the idea of going to Rossland, but eventually they came to Fort Steele. And as you say, that was in about May 1897.
He came up first and made a trip to kind of...
He remained here, yes.
Oh, he did remain.
And then my brother came back and took us up, and we came up in the buckboard, or the Democrat. One boy on horseback, and it was really thrilling. We had some eventful days, beautiful weather all the time. But it was... I look back on a few of the little instances, you know. The roadhouses were closed, and I could say we had to camp out in one place where we were. It was near some lake, and the place was just a swarm of these big moths. They called them millers.
Yes, yes.
So we didn't get any sleep that night because the place was just alive with them. That I remember quite well.
Where would you cross the borders? That would be where Roosevelt or...
I'd imagine around there.
Yes.
But there's no customs officer
no
there.
Customs.
You just Fort Steele, that's Mr. Clark. And we came right on through, and then we came up the next day and did the inspecting. And there were no immigration officers like that.
You would spend possibly 2 or 3 days between the border and Fort Steele, just taking your time in the buckboard.
I imagine it was about 5 days trip, because we were in Steele about 2 days before the big prairie schooner arrived. It was part of our furniture.
Oh, it followed...
It followed us, yes.
I see. One of the prairie schooners.
Well, it was our own. Well, I mean, they hired this man.
Yes.
Through, you see. He started out a day ahead of us, but we overtook him, and we were in Fort Steele 2 days ahead of him.
That would have all your furniture
Yes, part of it.
Things
Just
like
part of
that.
it. His father had this little house, and he had a little repair shop downtown, and he made a larger store afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Carried some jewelry and that sort of thing.
He had a kind of, was it a jewelry store? And
Yes. Carried not a great lot.
No.
There was a jewelry store there, which folded up. His name was Betts, and I gave all the information to Mr. Neal. But he folded up eventually, and so my father was left alone all those.
When you landed in Fort Steele, what did you think of it? Did you like it, or what was your impressions, if you remember?
Well, it was something like what we had left. You know, it was open country, but I was amused at the school. Wasn't used to this one room with all the different classes in it, you know, and the kids running helter-skelter free will.
You went to school in Fort Steele?
Yes. It's the present English church. That was the school.
The present
English church.
Is that so?
Church.
That was the one-room school.
That was the one-room school, and the other one was built. It wasn't finished, because we went and then we went to school the next year in the present school.
In the present school?
Yes.
That's interesting. After school, you worked in the post office in Fort Steele?
Yes. I went into the post office in about 1902, I think.
Is that so?
And I was there for a year with Mr. Can, and then the post office was given over to Henry Kershaw, and I stayed there for a year. And I came to Cranbrook in 1903.
When you were around Fort Steele, your activities as young people, I suppose, you would skate, would you, in the winter?
Oh, definitely. On the Kootenay coast.
Mm-hmm.
And skating down there one night, and one boy went through the river, the ice. The river.
Did he get drowned? He didn't drown, did he? They got him out?
They pulled him out. He just went up to about his shoulders. And that was Mike Dury. He was a nephew of the man who owned the Fort Steele, what is now it was Carlin Dury at that time.
There was quite a number of churches even at that time in Fort Steele. Fort Steele was actually at that time just about its peak, wasn't it?
Yes, the church, the English church, Anglican services were held in what is the Masonic Hall. They had services there until the school was vacated, and the Presbyterian church was being built. They had some services there, I think, in the next year, about 98, and. I guess they had some in 97, but it wasn't finished. They were finishing it because it was Ralph Connor who dedicated the church, and that would be around 98.
Is that so? Have you any recollection personally of Ralph Connor? His appearance and
just as he looks in his pictures with his beard and his fairly tall man, you know, and sort of prepossessing person. I know he came and spoke to all the school kids who were there.
A nice way, I suppose.
Very nice.
Yes, I would think
so. He's a charming man.
Yes. He dedicated the church?
The church, yes, or opened it, whatever they would.
Yes.
Germany dedicated, I guess.
He was traveling in the West quite a lot about that time, I guess.
Yes, I think he was getting data for some of his books, too, at that time.
You remember the Galbraiths? Would they be?
Very well. Yes, Mr. Galbraith. He married Mrs. Galbraith about 1912, I think. But Mr. Galbraith was there, and then his sister-in-law, Mrs. John Galbraith, was living there then, and Hazel Galbraith was her daughter. And of course, we all went to school together, you see.
There's one R.L.T. Galbraith is buried in the Fort Steele Cemetery.
Yes,
that would be
is familiarly known as Bobby Galbraith.
Is that so? That's the first we've known about that.
Yes.
Bobby Galbraith.
Bobby Galbraith.
Well,
he was the Indian agent, and
you would possibly have some recollections of some boat landings close to Fort Steele.
Yes, the boats that weren't running in 97, that's why we had to come overland. They came from Jennings up. And then the next year, I think the first boat up was the J.D. Farrell. It was a new boat. And it was her maiden voyage. And of course, every boat was like in the olden days in Cranbrook when the train came in, everybody flocked to the train.
That's true.
And that hillside would be black with people.
Is that so?
There were 2 steps down from the different hotels, you see, down to the road.
Those would
and
be...
the bridge would be just black with people.
They'd be long steps, like a lot of steps
Yes,
coming down
right
that
in
bank. Is that so?
bank. And the boat, of course, looked such a massive one compared with it was so much bigger than the old North Star. And then there was another one I think they called it was a smaller boat came through. It was quite small. But they made trips that summer, and then the next summer, of course, by that time the railroads coming to Cranbrook, that there were only a few trips made the following summer. That would be 99. There were only a few boat trips that year, and then there were no more.
Well, that's wonderful. You have a very clear recollection of the Farrell and the North Star coming up.
Yes.
There'd be quite a few come up on those boats.
Oh, lots of passengers, yes. And they'd go right on through to Golden, you see. Transfer up there. And some came to Fort Steele, and then they took the stages up wherever they were going. But the boat went right through, I believe, to Winter, go through to Alphamere, up the river. And there was some years later that Mr. Captain Armstrong brought the North Star up. He had an excursion trip. And we went to Wausau.
On the
Wausau.
On the North Star?
On the North Star. And Niels Hansen had a wonderful dinner for everybody, as he always did.
That would be almost a banquet, I suppose.
Yes, oh yes.
That would be in the old hotel.
The old hotel, the original hotel, yes, the little place.
It had beautiful furnishings in it, didn't it?
Well, yes, that was in the house.
Oh, I see.
That big 2-story house that he had, that he brought all the furniture from.
How many would you guess would be on the boat making this trip from Fort Steele to Wausau, this excursion?
I'm afraid I couldn't say. I'd have to make a wild guess.
Well, wild guess is better.
Might have been 75, might have been 100.
Yeah, well, that's
But I
interesting.
doubt I don't know just what the accommodation was, but there'd be perhaps around
Well,
maybe between 50 and 75, or maybe more.
and you'd go right up by where North Star Landing, as we know it now, is a historical point.
Well, there was a bridge. They land on the other side of the river, just about where the bridge is now, the present bridge.
Did they have any amusement on the boat? I suppose they'd be singing and enjoying themselves in general.
Well, they'd be quiet about the time they arrived at Steele, you see, so I don't know just what amusements they had on it, because I was never on it.
Like the Farrell and those, they would have some kind of cabins or staterooms.
Oh, yes. I don't know what to compare it to. Of course, when you're a kid, everything looks big, doesn't it?
That's very true.
But,
That's very true.
Oh, yes, it had its staterooms, and so it had the North Star. Had quite a few staterooms. But
that would be quite a job, going up and down those steps, wouldn't it? You said there was 2 distinct...
The hotels had them for the accommodations of the passengers, and people. They right at the back, they came down, and there's... when you go over, you might notice these sort of gullies.
Yes.
You know, well, those were the stairway.
Is that so? That's where the stairs up and down.
Well,
Well, then these boats would pull in close on the Fort Steele side of the Kootenay.
Yes, they did. And then the other year they were on this side.
I have some recollection of seeing some buildings on this side, just upriver from where the present bridge is. There was some buildings or something there.
I don't think on this side. They were on the other side.
On the other side.
There were warehouses, yes.
That's right. That.
I have some pictures, I think, at Fort Steele. I was going to give them to Mr. Yancey. And I know there's some taken to the high water at one tier. That'd be around 1916. And that shed was still there because the water was halfway up it, you see.
That shed would be for unloading freight and putting it under cover.
Yes, for the stores up Steele.
There'd be quite a number of stores in Steele.
There were 3. There's the Carl and Eric store, and then there was a Mr. Gilpin, G.H. Gilpin, and he moved his store to Cranbrook. and it was on the site where the Cranbrook trading store is. And Mr. W. McLaughlin was in it later on in years. And then we call it the American store. That was because there were Americans who controlled it. There was Mr. Hertz, who were the other names. Both German names at the moment, I can't think of it. So there were the 3 stores, and they carried all sorts of general merchandise, you know, and groceries.
Outside of Fort Steele at that time, in the area around it, it'd be some lumbering and some mining also.
Yes, there was a lumber yard just opposite where our house was, opposite the Catholic Church. And we youngsters would play hide and seek around it, you know. And the Masonic Lodge had or the Masonic Hall had a club upstairs, and there was a nigger porter. Well, he knew we lived there, you see, and we'd be playing hide and seek. And when we'd be on that side, we were looking for these, and then he'd point to us. He'd tell us where the others were. He wouldn't tell them where we were.
He was a Negro, was he?
Yes.
I have heard something about a Negro barber. Is that so?
Yes, there was. The High Wardens. Mr. Old Jim High Warden was a full-blooded Negro, and his wife was a white woman, and his son had the barber shop afterwards. He was Ed High Warden, too, and he was married to a white woman.
Apparently, they were quite well thought of, weren't they?
Oh, very, yes, they were
yes.
very respectable people. And they're very musical. This grandpa, they called him, was quite musical. He played the violin quite well.
Well.
And I know the little girl sat with me in school. We had the double seats, and the teacher would very often put one of the younger children with an older pupil, you see. And this little girl sat with me for a while. I used to get the charges, it seemed, and I had Edith McBride. You know, J.D. McBride, they lived over there. They had the house just, well, when you go to Wilder's now, it was up on the left-hand side.
There'd be law and order in Fort Steele, would that?
Oh, definitely.
That'd be long after the Mounties, wasn't it? They had gone then.
Oh, yes, because they were just a
It
few
would
years.
be provincial, or...
I presume it was provincial, yes,
Yes.
the constable. Mm-hmm. Mr. Barnes.
Mr. Barnes?
Barnes was the constable. Mm-hmm.
Now,
And he was the dentist, too. He extracted all the youngsters' teeth in school.
he pulled teeth and put them in jail if necessary. How many churches would there be in Fort Steele?
The 3.
The 3.
The Roman Catholic and the Presbyterian and the Anglican, Church of England as it was called then.
Would you remember any of the names of the ministers or the fathers at that time that were around there?
There was I think the last minister they had there was a Reverend Duncan, a Scotch one. And then there was not McClure, McCrae, what was that name? Or Cree, I believe it was. But the others I don't just recall. But Mr. Duncan was there quite a number of years.
Those churches as they were then, those are still the present churches.
Present churches, yes. And as
Well,
I say, the English church was in the Masonic Hall, and then they took over the schoolhouse in '98. It's been the Anglican church ever since.
Well, then we have the 3 churches in Fort Steele and also the schoolhouse that are actually very close to the original buildings.
That's right, they're just as they were, yes.
Now, I noticed when I was over in Fort Steele last fall there, at the house that Mrs. Galbraith owns now, we examined that pretty close, and it's built out of logs, upright,
Yes.
and there are some square spikes where it's been spiked. Now, that house, have you any recollection of that? It
Yes.
must be quite old.
That was Dr. Watt's house. He had that house and his office in there. And then after quite a number of years, there was a Mrs. Jennings who did practical nursing. So Mrs. And her 2 daughters moved into the house, and then the doctor built a little office beside, which is that little building up by the barracks.
Yes, yes, yes.
And that was moved up there with Dr. Bell at Fort Steele. And they moved that up there, and Dr. Bell lived in it. But the original house was Dr. Watts.
Now, we've heard quite a lot of rumors, and so far, unfortunately, that's all it has amounted to, about the time when they established the new cemetery in Fort Steele. And previous to this, these Mounties had died there, 4 of them, and they were buried in the vicinity of Fort Steele itself.
They were buried, the old cemetery was just about where you turn there where the cairn was. It was on the little hillside on the left-hand side. And the bodies were removed, I'd imagine around 98 or 99. Probably 99, because I say we played it around there. And the present cemetery it wasn't established, but I mean it was marked out because there had been some burials there already.
Yeah.
And the Mounties were moved there about, as I say, about 98 or, I'd imagine it was 99.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of course, it might even be 1900, but I think it was around there.
Yes.
It was earlier. I couldn't say definitely.
We're doing. Mrs. Falconer, there was, going back to the Mounties, we have heard that it was actually typhoid fever. Apparently there was quite a lot of it in the area at that time.
Yes, there was, and even after our arrival there were ever so many deaths from typhoid. As I say, they had nothing to control it with. And the hospital, as everyone knows, was at the mission at that time.
Oh, out here at the St. Eugene?
Yes, and as I say, they had no medicine, nothing else to combat it. And presumably the Mounties did die, but I dare say they did. I don't know, but that was the history of it too. There was a latter burial there. The man was brought in from... No, I don't think that was a Mountie. The Mounties brought him in. There was a man who was killed on the bridge and they brought him in. It wasn't a Mountie. But the Mounties brought him in from... And I know it was in the church. We would walk away on the other side of the road. We wouldn't pass there.
Later on they established a hospital of some kind in Fort Steele.
Yes, it was there when we went.
Oh.
There was a small building, and I think it's, as I say, I don't know whether the original building was there or not. Mr. Nichols would know. But they built on 2 additions, one on either side, and it was quite modern. They had 2 nurses. That was around 1914. And the established doctor was there, and the 2 nurses.
Speaking of 1914, I suppose there'd be quite a number of men join up in the war. Quite a number.
Yes, there were quite a number from Fort Steele. There was one boy that, he palled with my brother, was Archie Chisholm, and his brother is Colin Chisholm Kimberly. You see his name in the paper right now.
Yes.
And there were quite a number, quite a number of them returned, yes. There were the Walshes, and some others that returned, but there were some that were killed overseas. First war, of course.
George Barr showed me a picture last fall of quite a number of Fort Steele men that enlisted in the South African War, and Fort Steele had a band at that time.
Yes.
And the band is shown in this picture at this railroad station here in Cranbrook.
Yes, they had a band was there when we went.
Is that so?
Yes.
Brass band?
Brass band. I remember this Mr. Barnes, the policeman, he had a great big bass horn, and my brother had the trombone. But they had, and it was they who built the band hall. It was called the band hall, which is down by the hotel now. McMahon's bought it afterwards and made the hotel. See, it was always, we always called it the band hall because it was the band boys built it.
And that is the hotel that McMahon's later owned.
Yes,
Is that
it
so?
was.
Would that be the one that's just across the road from Howard's now
Yes,
with the
yes.
round pillars?
Yes.
Is that so?
It was moved down quite a number of years ago. Well, the McMahons bought it and they moved it down. Mr. Warden from Fort Steele, from Cranbrook, moved it down. But they had quite a number in the band. It was quite a good band.
I believe George Barr told me that his father played.
I believe he did,
played
yes.
an instrument.
Or
the
the
band?
drums or something.
Drum, that's it.
I think.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that's it.
I think so.
Yes. Would there be much activity up Wild Horse at that time? Off and on, I suppose.
Yes, there were some Chinese still working, quite a number of men, white men that were mining, and then the hydraulics were in operation.
Was Mr. Drayton in the area at that time? Or
No, he came about
afterwards?
23, I met 24 around that
Yes,
time,
yes.
because he had been there. Mr. Pilcher was there, 'cause my brother died in October 24, and I was over in Butte, Montana until next spring with my older brother. And when I returned, Mr. Pilcher was there. And I think he had bought out the holdings, or
In that book
he was
by
interested.
in that book by Smythe, Tales of the Kootenay, he's got a picture of a Chinaman there by the name of Lee Jack.
Yes,
Have any recollection of
I remember Lee Jack very well. And someone had, I think George Barr had a picture of old Lumpkin.
Oh, that was another one that we
Another
hadn't
one.
heard about.
Yes, he had the little house up on the side of, on the left-hand side as you go out to Wassa. He had a little garden and some chickens. There's an amusing incident about the chickens if you want to listen to it.
Indeed we do.
The boys from Ontario, and apparently they were used to raiding chicken houses down there. And I was telling this to Bart not so very long ago. And so they got into Lumpkins, and he had a great big coaching town. No, that was McBride had that, but he had all these chickens anyhow. They're red rolling reds and all kinds, big hens. And they took some of his. Well, there was a barber shop there. Mr. Grez had it. And George's brother, Ed Barr, or Tom Barr, was in the barber's chair. And old Lumpkin came in. So Mr. Grez was asking about different things, how he was. And he said, all right. He said, last night stunk catching a chicken. And Tom couldn't, he was just touching, so he was afraid to move for fear Mr. Grez would cut him with a razor. And because Tom was one of the culprits. He had to steal the chickens. And they had a chicken feed somewhere.
That mining up the creek, would those miners stay up the creek at that time, live
Yes.
up there, or
Yes.
would they travel back and forth?
Well, around 1924, of course, they traveled back and forth. But at that time, they stayed
At
up
that
there.
time
So,
they
yes.
stayed up. I
You see,
believe
there were quite a lot in the original Chinatown there. And then, as I say, there were the different houses that the different mining companies had in the early days, like Invicta Mines. Some of those men lived in those cabins.
at that time, they, of course, they used wagons to go up the creek. I would imagine when they were going up the creek then that they'd go up over the top of the hill to the left of the canyon, like turn to the left and go up the flat on the old original wagon road, which
Yes.
came in after
Yes,
the
they
trail.
would. And then go as far as the boat.
Brewery Creek.
Well, beyond that, a few miles. They'd go up over that hill and beyond that a few miles, because I know they, where they were working below, there was just about 6 miles from there up to the dam. And, of course, we'd go up on horseback a lot then.
You would ride horseback quite a lot around Fort
yes,
Steele.
we're all around the. I say we were over the old Dewdney Trail, and we'd go up those steep hills, and then we'd slide over the back of the horse. Go get on the stuff and get on.
You would ride over that section of the trail that we rebuilt
Yes,
last year.
Yes.
Is that so?
We'd go through the bushes and over, because I remember.
Well, now, you're the first one that I've talked to that's actually...
But we didn't know what it was at the time, you know.
But it was a well-traveled trail. And you
Well, I mean, we'd have to break through. The bushes were overgrown, you see, but we had the vestige of the trail was there, definitely.
well, that's very interesting. And, we have talked to different ones at Fort Steele, and very few had a recollection of that trail.
Oh.
Yeah. And you would ride over that trail and back.
We'd go around, yes.
You can get a grand view from it at different points.
Yes, I don't know just how far up we went. We wouldn't go to the end of it or anything, but we'd ride up, turn around, come back. Or climb up the side of the hill, like you would when you're riding to be adventurous.
Well, if we'd known all this, we'd have had you in the saddle at the opening of that trail last June. We weren't aware of this. Would you have, I think you could ride again.
Well, yes, I rode a side saddle and I rode a little stride afterwards, but...
When you were, folks were coming in over the Missoula Trail from Montana, you mentioned the saddle horse. You would ride on that part of it?
Occasionally. We'd perhaps ride a mile, but my brothers trained the horses and we had to. Well, one was driving while one brother was driving, and we'd take turns in riding the horse for a little ways, but not very far.
And this prairie schooner that you speak of, that was hired in Montana to bring your furniture up.
Yes.
That would be one of those actual covered wagons.
Yes, it was,
so?
yes.
Well.
And when we went from Great Falls to Kalispell, we had two of them, and the horse and buggy. My mother drove the horse and buggy and had the baby in it, my younger brother and my older sister, and we rode in the big wagons.
Is that so?
And that trip took quite a long time because they took the time. They wouldn't travel on Sundays.
No.
And if they would stop at a town, whether it was church,
yes.
At the end, if there was a festival, they could go to any church, but usually camped out and rested. And then if the weather were rainy or inclement, they would rest then too, you see. So it took about 3 weeks, and they came into what they called a Marsville. I think that's all incorporated in Kalispell now.
The West End, the American West End, was just actually starting to be settled in.
Yes.
The railroad would be largely responsible for a lot of the settlers coming in, I guess.
A lot, yes.
Yeah.
And there were lots of them came over.
And you see, the Canadian Pacific didn't come through until after you folks came into Fort Steele.
No, it was 98 when it came through here, just the year after. See, that's what put the boats out of joint. Put their noses out of joint.
Now, these boats, they traveled up and down the Kootenay when they were able to, till what, about 1899 or after that?
Yes, there were a few in 99, and that was the last year.
That was the end of the transportation on the river.
On the river, yes. Because then it was the second year after we were there that we, 98, be 99, there weren't very many. And they would discontinue in September, about that time, but they had stopped before that. I know it was quite, but we were probably having school holidays, which was only 6 weeks at that time.
Yes.
And when the last boat came up.
Mrs. Falconer, about the Fort Steele Cemetery there, would you know how they come to get the fence around it? Or?
Yes, I do very well. The Mrs. Levitt, who many people remember, was soliciting, and all the townspeople subscribed to it. And I took the privilege of putting on a dance one evening and raised some funds for it. And we were practically oversubscribed. And the fence was built the following year. That'd be around 25. And it was mostly local people who built it.
They have a nice iron gate there leading in.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that was all paid for. And there was the gate. I don't know. I guess that's still there.
Yes.
A small gate
Yes.
up the hill.
Yes. Now, there'd be quite a number of hotels in Fort Steele.
Yes, there were 5 hotels. The Delgower Gardner, which is called the Windsor now, and an International, that burned down, and there was the Mountain House, the Oriental, opposite the street, and then there was another one further down the street. The name of it, I don't know whether it was ever named or not, but it seems to me it's called the Northern, or something like that. And of course they had a bank there too, as we all know. which is the present store. That was the Cleveland Bank of Commerce, where Mr. Dempsey has the store.
Is that so?
And the post office, I'll say all that was burned down, and they had the big fire where Mr. Kershaw had his store, and the post office where I had served for a year opposite it. And then all that block burned, and they made this building, which was vacant at the time, into the post office.
Well, they, in some of the older pictures, they showed sidewalks, wooden sidewalks.
Oh, yes, they had sidewalks right on down to the tank, and then the steps down to the station, you know. And there were sidewalks up to the hospital. That was up past the Presbyterian Church up in that way, and there were sidewalks up to the churches. Between the two churches, they built those later. But they had the big sidewalks, wide sidewalks on either side of the street.
And there wouldn't be such a thing as a Model T Ford around, I suppose, until later years, like...
No, my brother had a Model T. Previous to that, there was Al Doyle had it was an electric driven. I think that was the first car they had there in Steele.
Yes, that's so. Speaking of Doyle, he was a lumberman, wasn't he? Freighter?
Well, yes, he did that, and he had the ranch. He had a big ranch out. I think the Foxes have it now. He was over there, and he dealt in mining and lumber. They all had their fingers in the different things.
I believe this Doyle, didn't they have a livery stable?
Yes, it was in the building that Art Howard's using now, and it was George Geary and Al Doyle had this big livery stable.
And you could hire...
Hired horses and buggies and buckboards and anything you wanted to ride in.
You could hire one, for instance, and ride to Cranbrook
yes,
if you wished.
Yes, I hired many and drove over.
And did you ever, in the winter time, did you ever get together and have sleigh rides or...
Not from Steele, no. We had coasting. I mean, no big toboggans, no bobsled rides. But we had our own cutter, and we'd drive in that, you know, and my people had their own horse.
With the robes and the bells?
Oh, all the buffalo robes and the bells, yes.
They make a nice sound, don't they, in the winter?
Yes. The coasting you did, of course, was sled sliding.
That would be down some of those steep hills around Steele.
Yes, we'd coast down the present grade there, and then we'd go back over to the right of the Wasser Road. Any big hill we could find, we'd coast down there, and down the Wild Horse. The original crossing was near where the station is now, and then they built bridges afterwards, of course, further on, and the second bridge was up quite a ways, which they were all washed out.
The old original road leading from Cranbrook over to Fort Steele come down that draw close to Niven's Corner, and I believe this present new location of the highway is going to come down the same old...
Well, no, that was the road to the mission.
Oh, that was the road?
The road to the mission, yes, we're through there. And they had a bridge over the Kootenay, which was washed out. But just at the top of the hill, not very far after you reach the top, there's a road that turns to the right. That was the road to the mission. And I don't know where I guess we turned off in that for the original road. They drove in that for a ways and then turned off the mission line.
That would be the old original road to the mission?
Yes.
Out to the hospital at the mission. Now, we done quite a little exploring around there last year. And there are certain signs that would point to the fact that this old road to the mission, previous to being a road, was part of the old Dewdney Trail, which wound around through the mission and out through that way.
Could be. I'm not familiar with that.
There's, little bits of the diggings which would lead you to think that it is the Dewdney Trail. You know how they graded it out and surveyed it and everything.
Yes.
Now, there was a brewery at Fort Steele at that time.
Yes, the Mutts and Sick had the brewery, and it was just at the foot of the grade. It was on the right-hand side. The first creek that you come to is where they got their water from, which was recognized as the best water in BC for making beer. Because after they moved to Fernie, the beer wasn't the same, they contended. But they had quite a large, big brewery there.
And that was the original start of the Chic breweries, as I understand.
Yes, they moved to Fernie. I don't know just what year that was. Perhaps around 1900, whenever they moved to Fernie anyhow, and Mutts and Sick had it there, and then eventually Mr. Mutts died, I believe, and Sick controlled it. I don't know nothing about that.
And they went on from there.
Yes.
I believe today they're all over North America.
I believe they are.
Yes, I think so. Mrs. Faulkner, I think this about covers our recording, and we would like to thank you very, very much for your time and trouble in this recording. It's just been wonderful. Now, at our annual meeting next Friday night, I believe you and Mr. Faulkner are coming, aren't you?
Yes, we intend to.
Well, we would be very pleased to have you with us.
Well, thank you very
And
much.
thank you.
And this today has been a pleasure. I had lots of time, and I don't know about my contributions, whether they're fruitful or not, but I enjoyed giving it.
Well, it's been our pleasure, I can assure you, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is a recording of the restoration of 1.5 miles of the Dewdney Trail up Wild Horse Creek above Fort Steele. This restoration was carried out by the Historical Association of East Kootenay in the spring of 1961. The ceremony held at the reopening of the trail is also recorded. In 1959, our Historical Association had a field trip and a picnic up Wild Horse, around the cemetery and up around the diggings and whatnot. Mrs. Lum from Fort Steele, she was along with Mrs. MacDonald and myself. And on the way down, just about where the canyon flattens out onto the foothills there, she said that she and her husband, the late George Lum, had been out riding, and that he told her that it was here that the old original trail went up over the top of the canyon and back down into the diggings up Wild Horse. She asked Mr. Lum just exactly where it was, but he just gave a wave of his hand in a general direction of the cliff and always said up there. Well, that was the only clue we had. I inquired around Fort Steele and Cranbrook and amongst all the old-timers and various other ones, but they didn't know anything about it. It was a little too late at that time of year to start looking. That was in the fall of '59. So in the spring of 1960, we started out and finally located it. It was very difficult. The trail hadn't been used for possibly, 70, 80 years, or somewhere in there. And it was all overgrown with second growth. And to make matters a little worse, up on the top of the canyon, or the cliff up on the top, any case, where it flattened out, there was quite a lot of large timber, big trees, possibly 20 inches, 2 feet through. And in 1959, there had been severe windstorms swept through that area, and these trees were all blown down or else broken off. And they were crisscrossed some places up to 5 and 6 feet high. You had to go through on your hands and knees. for to blaze the trail, and that is to be sure you were following the trail as it was originally built. But however, by the fall of 1960, there was no doubt in my mind that this was the original trail. At our general meeting and election of officers held in January 1961, I was appointed to go ahead with the restoration of the trail, asking for whatever help I could get. Mr. and Mrs. Art Howard from Fort Steele, they were at the meeting, and Art volunteered the use of his chainsaw. This was very important, for without a chainsaw, I doubt very, very much whether we could have restored the trail. We all have to work for a living, so consequently the work on this trail had to be done on weekends, that is Saturdays and Sundays and the odd holiday possibly. There was Art Howard with his chainsaw, Fort Steele, Cliff White from Fort Steele, and Al Buckman, the guide and packer out of Fort Steele. Al also volunteered the use of his chainsaw. And from Cranbrook, there was Jim Nelson and myself. This was the crew that rebuilt the trail. We started in on the 8th of April. We worked Saturdays and Sundays. We couldn't all be there every weekend, that is every Saturday and Sunday, but there was nearly always 2 to 3 or 4 of us there. We finished the work on the trail on the 10th of June. This was one day ahead of the ceremony, which was held on the 11th. And we put in 52 and a half man days in all. There was a lot of hard work, the grub hoeing and the chainsawing, and also a lot of axe work. And various places where the trail flattened out, you couldn't see it. But as soon as you started to scrape off the moss, there it was, the old grade that the Dewdney engineers had put in, which called for a width of 4 feet. And as soon as you scratched off the moss and the grass, there was the old trail. This particular place I mentioned earlier, where you had to go through on your hands and knees, Art Howard and Al Buckman had a tremendous amount of work to do, because we had to cut those big trees up in short pieces so you could manhandle them away. And the grubbing too was pretty tough. There was one section of trail, there was some young pondosa pine had grown up, and they're noted to root pretty deep, especially the big taproot. And there was one section there of about 150 feet that Cliff White and I took out over 30 of them. And the reason we grubbed them out, we thought it was better to do this, because by cutting them off close to the ground, and later on when riders started to go over the trail, the ground would be worn down around these stumps, and consequently it wouldn't be very safe. So we grubbed everything out to be sure of what we were doing. Here and there along the trail, we ran out of evidence of the old original cuttings. And also there was some diggings along the trail. The diggings were pretty well towards the far end. On the slope going up from the Fort Steele side, there was very little diggings. But on the other slope going down into Wild Horse, the early miners apparently had been up all over that toe of the mountain checking for gold. By checking, I mean they put in crosscuts down to bedrock, and they sunk pits here and there. And those that are close to the trail, we painted signs, and If any of you go over the trail, you'll see the signs there. The ones that are painted showing the original cuttings, we were very careful with those because we didn't want to make any mistake. And as there had been some logging many years ago in there, we had to distinguish between the logging and the actual cutting of this trail. So this took quite a bit of time. But we are well satisfied in our own mind that those signs that we put up showing the original cuttings do date back to the time that this trail first went in. Up about a half a mile from the start of the trail, that is from the Fort Steele side, we cut out a viewpoint there. There was a lot of second growth on it and whatnot, but we cleared it all off, and then we put up posts and put a guardrail around it. And if you're ever over the trail, just stop and take a look there. The view is just hard to describe. You can see up Wild Horse, look down into the diggings, spread up miles and miles ahead of you, and then to the south, to your right a little, you can see down the valley from the vicinity of Fort Steele all the way down the Kootenay towards Wardner and Bull River. And I dare say if the air was clear enough, you could see pretty well down to the Elko country. At one section of the trail, about halfway through, up on the top where it flattens out, it skirted along the edge of the canyon. At this particular point, the trail had slid away. It was originally on the slope and rock. So we started in to rebuild this section. You had to do it because otherwise all our work would be of no use. So we started to dig out this sloping rock face and what earth there was, and underneath here we found the old original cribbing. And there's no doubt in our minds that this cribbing had been put in there by Dewdney and his men. Anyhow, it was of no use. We hated to destroy it, but that was it. So we dug it out, and then we flattened it out, and we built a rock wall, a retaining wall for the trail. We had to build up this rock wall, possibly 4 or 5 or 6 feet high, and there was a rather amusing thing happened. Cliff White was with me at this particular time, and after we got this foundation flattened out, we had to have a big flat rock for to anchor the wall on. So Cliff said to me, he said, I know exactly where they are. So away he went up around the corner to the trail, and he come back in a little while, and he was rolling this great big flat rock ahead of him. And I was down below, and I offered to come up and help him drop it down into this flat spot where it had to be laid. No, he said, I can do it, he said. No trouble at all. You stay right where you are. Well, Cliff worked it over to the edge very carefully, and then he let her go. Well, it came down to where I was, a little offside from me, and before I could get to it, it landed on its edge, and it teetered there for a second or two, and then over it went, down into the canyon, hundreds and hundreds of feet below. Cliff never even swore. He stood looking at me with kind of a grin on his face, and well, he said, I guess we didn't want that one anyhow. So back up the trail he went, and in a little while he came back with another one. And this one, of course, we handled a little different. But anyhow, we got this retaining wall in, and then we put up a guardrail around it and braced this guardrail. This was the only point in the trail that there was any actual danger to the riders going over the trail. And there would be danger if this wall gave out, because it was very steep below and a very, very long ways down. But anyhow, the day that the trail was open and the riders went over, everything went off very well. And since that time, I've checked with others that have gone over the trail, and this particular section is standing up very well. One Sunday when Cliff and I were working there, we scouted around a little bit offside from the trail, and we found some old diggings. And close to the diggings on a rocky point, we found what I think is one of the original mining post claims. The reason that this wasn't rotted away, I think, largely was in the beginning, when it was made, it was squared out of a living tree. And as the years went by, it rotted off at the base. And when it fell over on the rock. If it had been on the ground, of course, the contact would have rotted it away. But it was quite sound. Unfortunately, there's no dates on it. But we checked the diggings, and from the size of the trees that were growing in these diggings itself, and other evidence, there's no doubt in our minds that this is one of the original mining posts in Wild Horse. Unfortunately, there was no date on it, but we're quite satisfied. And we brought it in, and it's now over at Fort Steele, and I think will eventually go into the museum when it's built. We had very few visitors while we were working on the trail. There was a Miss K. McLaughlin from Ontario. She's one of the directors of the Historical Association of Ontario. She was brought out to the end of the trail by Miss Nancy Miles, and Miss McLaughlin wanted very much, as she called it, to put her feet on the Dewdney Trail. So I took her up to this first viewpoint, and she took some colored slides there, and we come back down, and she was actually the only visitor on the trail while we were working on it. And Nancy Miles, one Sunday evening, or afternoon rather, she brought us out a hot lunch. And it was very nice of Nancy, and it was well cooked, and you can imagine that this was very much appreciated. This was very heavy work, and we got chased out different times. There's thunderstorms, hailstorms, and the wood ticks were very, very bad that year. But after it was all done, I think we enjoyed what we had accomplished. This part of the recording has to do with the ceremony held at the reopening of the trail. It was written by Nancy Miles and appeared in the Nelson News of June the 13th, 1961. It's headed, "Many Special Guests with Historical Links at Dewdney Trail Reopening." It reads as follows: "More than 500 Cranbrook and Kimberley people ventured into Wild Horse Canyon east of Fort Steele Sunday afternoon to attend the opening of the final mile-and-a-half section of the Dewdney Trail to the vicinity of Fisherville along Wild Horse Creek. Mrs. R.L.T. Galbraith, early day Fort Steele resident, and Arthur Nichols, for more than 50 years, guide at Fort Steele, cut the ribbon, opening the trail. The scissors he used were handicrafted from 2 files by some unknown early miner and found by Mr. Nichols 50 years ago in a disintegrating log cabin on what is presumed was the site of Fisherville in 1864 when the gold rush occurred on Wild Horse Creek. Mr. Nichols then joined the cavalcade of saddle horses and 2 pack horses which rode over the 1.5 miles. About 40 adults and children followed the horses on foot over the trail. Peter Dewdney, trail lawyer and grandnephew of Edgar Dewdney, who built this first Pacific Rocky Mountain Trail across British territory, spoke from the entrance to the trail before the ribbon was cut. He said Edgar Dewdney was 22 years old when he built the trail, and quoted his father's memoirs of Uncle Edgar following his retirement to Victoria when he was known as Old White Beard. Edgar Dewdney left what was to become British Columbia for eastern Canada soon after the Dewdney and Caribou trails were completed. After Confederation of Canada in 1867, he was a member of Parliament and the Cabinet. He's a member of Parliament and the Cabinet in the government of his good friend Sir Dan A MacDonald. His department dealt with Indian affairs, and he became governor of Northwest Territories, now the 3 Prairie provinces. Following this government service in the 1890s, he was named Lieutenant Governor of the new province of British Columbia and continued his home in Victoria thereafter until his death. Mr. Dewdney brought with him from trail a beautifully crafted silver medal presented by Queen Victoria to Chief Crowfoot of Alberta in acknowledgement of his service to the Crown in reconciling the interest of British colonizers and the Indians of that area. Chief Crowfoot bequeathed the medal to his friend Edgar Dewdney on his death. Also in Peter Dewdney's possession of his granduncle's letters and papers is the Louis Riel death warrant, which he had to sign as governor of Northwest Territories. In the preliminaries at the Fort Steele Northwest Mounted Police Barracks and in the actual ceremonies, the Kootenay Indian School Band, with marching music and drills, played a magnificent part in the program, arranged through Captain Lyle of the RCE Battery Unit, with services of 2 of his unit's drivers and trucks for the transportation. Guests at the ceremony included Mrs. Alice Parnell of Grasmere, daughter of Michael Phillips, who was first Hudson's Bay factor of this part of the interior in 1864 at a trading post just above Wild Horse Creek, where the Canyon Road starts, of which there are still a few visible traces. Also guests were Mr. and Mrs. Colin Sinclair Roosevelt, the former a grandson of James Sinclair, discoverer of the Sinclair Canyon at Radium Hot Springs. Other special guests perched on the rocks alongside the trail entrance were Mrs. Peter Dewdney of Trail, Mrs. H.C. Falconer of Cranbrook, better known as Tanny, during her years of post office service at Fort Steele, Historical Association Secretary Dan MacDonald, who located the disappearing remnants of the trail in early spring, and his crew of Cliff White, Art Howard, and Alan Buckman of Fort Steele, and Jim Nelson of Cranbrook. These volunteers grubbed the trail out with saws, axes, and hoes. Association President J.W. Almack was master of ceremonies, outlining briefly the trail's history and introducing each of the guests. L.T. Nimsek, MLA, Cranbrook, and Harry McKay, MLA, Fernie, were riders in the cavalcade. Making up the cavalcade were the Buckman party, Packstring, and the dozens who walked after the horses to return to the Forestry Development Road near the Kootenay Base Concentrator, where, enthusiastic about the view the excursion offered southward over the miles of Wild Horse and Kootenay River. There were more than 100 cars in the parade along the Forest Development Road to the Kootenay Base Meadows. They were lined up along the canyon road to greet the cavalcade and the hikers when they emerged from the trail to parade with the band down to the meadows. The guests at the ceremony then had their individual picnic lunches on the meadow, and many walked a mile and a half further to the reclaimed Wild Horse Cemetery near the creek and the site of Fisherville of 1864, of which no trace remains, unquote. This trail up over the top had to go that way in the beginning of the gold rush, because it was impossible at that time to take time out to build the trail straight through the canyon, where the walls are straight up and down in places. And later on, possibly in the 70s and 80s, they had a wagon road into the diggings, which went up and over the top, but further north, where the ground was more suitable for grading a road. Now, I'm not too sure, but it could be in the 90s or thereabouts, that there was a trail of sorts built along the canyon just above the creek, straight through. And Art Howard of Fort Steele, in his younger days, Art was up the creek, and there was a famous old character there, a Chinese miner by the name of Lee Jack. As a matter of fact, Lee Jack stayed there, the last miner on the creek, the last of the originals. And he would get a little gold, and he was quite happy. He'd come to town and get what he wanted and go back up. But that was his existence, and he liked it. Anyhow, Art was up the creek one day, and he stopped and was talking to Lee Jack, and he said to him, it must have taken a lot of powder, Lee, to put that trail straight down the creek, or rather along the creek. It's possibly 100 to 150 feet above the creek along the rock face. He said, I don't see how the Chinaman ever got money enough, he said, to buy powder. It'd take an awful lot of powder. No, Lee Jack said, no powder at all. He said, you know what? And Art said, no. He said, the China boys, he said, they cut wood, and they pile it on the rock, set fire to it, get a good hot fire, and then go like a hell to the creek and get water and dump them on the rock, and poof goes the rock. Well, there you are, folks. That's the story of the first trail through the canyon on the Wild Horse. This section of trail that we have rebuilt was a very important one in the early days of the gold rush. The miners coming in from Montana over the Kalispell Trail, those coming in over the Walla Walla Trail further west, and those coming in over the Dewdney direct from the coast, they all had to pass over this section of trail in order to get into the diggings. Some of those that went in didn't come out. They rest in the Wild Horse Cemetery. Just where the trail takes off for to go up over the bluff, this is where the Kalispell Trail joined the Dewdney Trail. And Art Nichols, of Fort Steele, when Art first came in to the district, he told me that at that time there was a pack bridge across Wild Horse Creek just below and very close to where the trail starts up. And this pack bridge, of course, has long since disappeared. Now, down at Bonner's Ferry, that is going from Kingsgate to Bonner's Ferry, just at the end of the bridge, before you cross over going into Bonner's, on the right-hand side, they have erected a historical plaque there. It's quite large, and there's a lot of detail on it. And it mentions there the miners crossing the Kootenay River with the Indians first, and later when Bonner's put in a ferry, which is how Bonner's come to get his name in the first place. And it mentions there the miners crossing the river for what they call Wild Horse Creek. They have reserved a nice little parking place there, green grass and whatnot. And to those of you who are interested, when you go down that way, just take time out to pull off to the right-hand side, right at the, just before you go over the bridge, and you can park there and read the signs. It's very attractive, and a very attractive setting also. We have been the first in British Columbia to restore a section of the Dewdney Trail, and we hope that others will follow our example. I don't think it's nearly enough just to put up a sign here and there along our main highway and marking just the Dewdney Trail. While this is very necessary, but I think it's even much more so for to actually go in and restore these sections of the trail so that people that are interested can either hike or ride over them. This new highway between Creston and Salmo, call it, I think most of them call it the Salmo-Creston Cutoff. Now the Dewdney Trail come over through that pass, down Summit Creek, and as I understand it, crossed the Kootenay River somewhere in the vicinity of Nick's Island or the end of Kootenay Lake, and come up through close by Windle and cut in behind what is now known as Goat Mountain. I would imagine that that would be a shorter route than coming around through what is now Creston and Erickson. And it came out somewhere in the vicinity of where the present highway crosses Ara Creek. Now this is a section that could be checked over, and if my information is correct, this would be an objective for some association or the government or what have you to go ahead and restore it. This could possibly be a longer section than we have restored up in the Wild Horse. And I understand that over in the Roslyn Trail area, there are also sections of the trail, and also further west. And so it goes. And let us hope that someday the government will see fit to actually restore these sections of the trail. As I said before, putting up a sign is very necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient. This is our heritage not to be neglected. When Edgar Dewdney was governor of the Northwest Territories, which is now the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, he had to choose a site for what was later to become the capital of Saskatchewan. The choice narrowed down to two sites. One was Fort Qu'Appelle, and the other was what is now known as the city of Regina. Edgar Dewdney chose Regina, and therefore the city of Regina has a very close connection with the accomplishments and the history of Edgar Dewdney. This is the end of the recording. Dan MacDonald speaking. This is a recording from the book written by Baillie-Grohman, Sport and Life in Western America and British Columbia. Dan MacDonald speaking. This is his description of the Midge. The Midge was the first steamboat on the Kootenay waters and was brought in by Baillie-Grohman. It traveled up and down from what is now Bonner's Ferry, past Creston, and along Kootenay Lake. Quote, "One of the conditions of my land concession from the British Columbia government was that I should forthwith place a steamer on the navigable portions of the lower Kootenay River and Lake. This was a far more formidable plan than I had anticipated, for as I have said, the country was then a perfectly wild region. Dick Fry, with his squaw and half-dozen half-breed children at their ranch, where now stands the thriving town of Bonner's Ferry, being the only resident white man on the whole of the lower Kootenay country. After obtaining prices from Oregon boat builders at Portland, I came to the conclusion that the speediest and probably cheapest way of fulfilling my engagement was to bring a steam launch owned by an English friend who, with a few others, had joined me in carrying through the land enterprise over from the Old World and take her by rail as far as Sand Point, and from thence transport her overland to Dick Fry's ranch, which was the nearest point on the Kootenay River. She had last navigated the waters of Norwegian fjords, so, though small in size, her teak hull made her a staunch little craft. I brought her across the ocean on the deck of the Polynesia, landing her at Montreal, from whence, by taking advantage of the artificial and natural waterways that penetrate into the heart of the continent, she was finally put on 2 Northern Pacific cars at Duluth, almost halfway across the continent of North America. Canada, we know, protects her home industries by a very high customs tariff, and among the few articles that can be taken in duty-free are settlers' goods, including agricultural machinery that has been previously used. On landing at Montreal, the customs officials demanded several $100 duty on the old steam launch. To this I objected, and as I had letters from a member of the cabinet at home to Sir John A. MacDonald and others in high official positions, I thought I would test their efficiency at Ottawa. The amount and rigidness of the red tape the official world of Canada knows is something incredible, and while I soon saw that the head of the department was anxious to meet my views, he could of course only do so by abiding by the regulations. The point I tried to make was that if settlers could bring in a steam plow duty-free, I should be able to do the same with the steam launch. For as I laughingly argued, in the present overflowed conditions of the tracts of land I was acquiring in Lower Kootenay, it would certainly require a steam launch to draw the plow. The minister smiled at my feeble joke, and to the utter consternation of the Montreal customs authorities, I returned from Ottawa with a permit in my pocket authorizing me to clear the launch duty-free as a settler's agricultural implement. I was told subsequently that this was quite a unique instance and deserved being put in a glass case. When the steam launch arrived at Sandpoint on its 2 long trucks, I was startled by its size out of water. The trail, which at that time led over the Pack River Pass to Dick Fry's, was about the crookedest, narrowest, and most up and down path through dense forest imaginable, and it seemed an utterly impossible job to take this craft, though lightened of its somewhat old-fashioned heavy boiler machinery, which she took out before loading her on the cars at Duluth across this pass in the Selkirk Range. A large force of Kootenay Indians and some 10 or 12 white men, assisted by stout tackle and pulleys, at last managed the business, though it took upwards of 3 weeks and cost a large sum. For the great part of the 40 miles, the present good wagon road, by taking a straight course, has cut down the distance by 2/5. The hull was carried bodily by the men while on the steep hills where she could not be carried. We pulled her up or let her down on rollers with pulleys fastened to trees. On one such occasion, when we were letting her down a very steep hill, one of the ropes broke, just as I was lying on my stomach underneath the bow of the hull fixing the rollers. Fortunately for me, these rollers, which consisted of bark logs cut from a tree, were more than a foot in diameter, and the squeeze I got as the hull skidded over me was not very serious, but it wasn't very pleasant either. The hull was brought up at the foot of the hill by a bank of clay soil in which she buried her bow, hurting the bank more severely than she did herself or the boss, as the men observed after they helped me to my legs and seen I'd escaped death. The Midge was the first steamer to navigate any part of the Kootenay River or lake, and can therefore claim to be a historical craft. Amongst the flatbows, she created the most profound surprise, the whole tribe dashing down to the river bank when they heard her infantile puffs. The biggest thing about the Midge was her whistle, and to get permission to pull the string and send forth a blast was the most prized privilege I could bestow on any buck I desired to distinguish. This I turned to practical use, for as dry wood was unobtainable for fuel, driftwood on the river banks had to be used. So long as I provided a buck saw, the like of which instruments these primitive Indians had never seen, they were quite ready to cut up big stacks at different points of the river in return for a few minutes at the whistle, or getting their canoes towed. This was an economical way of solving a difficulty which besets most pioneer steam navigation in the waters of an inhabited country, and generally causes either much delay in having the crew land and cut the necessary supply, or considerable expense by having to establish wood camps along the route. The experience of that summer, 1884, in spite of the hard work and the sinister events to which I have already referred, were of the most pleasant kind. For there is something strangely attractive about the exploration of virgin wilderness amid such scenery as met the eye at every point along the winding Kootenay River and the 70-mile-long lake. I have mentioned that Dick Fry was the only white resident in all that vast country, the American portion of the lower Kootenay country being then as uninhabited as was the British portion. But I must not forget to mention a very interesting old character who lived Indian fashion in a miserable hovel close to where the 49th parallel crosses the lower Kootenay River at right angles. This was old Dave McLaughlin, only surviving son of the famous Dr. McLaughlin, once absolute monarch of a realm much larger than Germany or France, extending from California up to Alaska and comprising part of both. This remarkable man was in days anterior to the Treaty of Washington the supreme ruler of the Hudson Bay Company territory on the Pacific slope. Old Dr. McLaughlin, like all of the company's officers who took unto themselves wives, had in the early days of his career married a native woman by whom he had 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest son, who was addicted to drink, was killed in a drunken brawl while in command of Fort Steele in 1842. The second, David, a boy of a more genial and adaptable character, was sent in the 30s to Europe to be educated. And even when I knew him as a very old man who had long relapsed into the dirt and savagery of Indian life, one soon discovered that he had received the education of a gentleman, was versed in 3 or 4 languages, and had seen the world. An old cone-shaped hat adorned with a few glass beads and as dilapidated and dirty as any the naked Indians wore covered his long matted hair. And it was this hat which gave him his name, by which he was known among all the Indians in the country, that is, Kiskayuka, or very old hat. Old David, I soon discovered, was the most interesting relic of the early pioneers of the slope, and it was indeed singular to meet this son of a remote past in those late times, when literally millions inhabit the country which this man's father had ruled in days when outside the fur company's employees there was not a score of white men in the whole vast territory. Close to the hovel in which he and his large Indian family dwelt, in unspeakable squalor and filth, there stood a big log structure, which had once been the Hudson Bay Company's trading post, known as Fort Flatbow. It was entirely empty, and as the ill-fitting logs of which it was built were shaped with an axe, the storms and sunshine of half a century had not improved their weather-resisting qualities. Hence, the chinks and crannies were numerous and big enough to dispense with the windows, over the sashless empties of which rough boards had been nailed. This building and the miserable pigsty inhabited by McLaughlin were the only roofed habitations in the Kootenay Valley, when once Fry's Ranch at the extreme south end of the valley was left. The former stood but a stone's throw from the boundary. In fact, the stone pyramid, which the Boundary Commission caused to be built at this point a quarter of a century before, to mark the place where the line crossed the river, stood in old Dave's potato patch at the back of his hut. Erected by the Hudson's Bay Company post, the post had reverted to the United States when, after the Washington Treaty, the company abandoned its possessions south of the 49th parallel. Old Dave, born and reared in a similar though much larger fort, that is, Fort George on the Columbia, had in him all the instincts of the old days, and had settled on the spot on which I found him more than a third of a century before. He preempted 320 acres of the land around it, and on a quarter of an acre of it he grew his only crop of potatoes. The old barn-like main building was far too roomy for his wants in summer and too cold in winter, so he forsook it and took up his abode in the pigsty close by. A hasty examination of the walls convinced me that with a little patching up and filling in of the chinks, the building would make a fairly tight, weatherproof building for a year or two longer. And as I was badly in want of some such a place where I could store things, and which I could use as a headquarters while in the country, I determined to make old Dave an offer for it. No great run had apparently affected the price of old forts. Moreover, Dave's potatoes, upon which he and his family subsisted, had not done very well that year, and whisky galore could be had at the other end of a 70-mile ride to Sand Point. Dave's squaw and entirely naked children looked so miserable and half-starved that I framed my offer with an eye to their condition, and the $100 I gave for the fort was made up of a 50-pound sack of flour, which was then worth $10 and $90 in cash. My offer was jumped at. 5 minutes later, I had Dave's neat signature on the conveyance. I scribbled on the only paper available, a leaf out of my notebook. It is not the least interesting memento I still possess of my fort-buying days. Poor good-natured old David would not have occupied the sorry position I found him in had not whiskey ruined his life. He was, moreover, as generally the case with a squaw man's establishment, constantly preyed upon by a squaw's numerous relations, which sponged on him with the callous persistence of their race. Within 10 minutes after I passed over the greenbacks to Dave, who had hidden them away in the cone of his hat, his tattered shirt and trousers being apparently unprovided with pockets, his scantily costumed tillicums came rushing in from their camp close by, laughing and chattering at the good news of the untold wealth of Chickaman. How to get quickly to Sand Point seemed to be the most exciting question. The Flatbows on the British side possessed no horses whatever, but their kinsmen in the Kootenay Valley possessed a few, for they had been having for once good luck in their gambling with the wild cow spells. The nearest Kootenay camp was many miles off, but by some mysterious means the news of Kiskayuka's fortune spread so quickly that in 2 hours 3 unspeakable sorry-looking steeds were standing outside old David's shack. Only one had a saddle on, while the other 2 were disfigured by great running sores on their backs and cruelly scored flanks. Upon these 3 depressing specimens of man's best friend, Dave and 4 of his tillicums proceeded to ride off. Dave had the horse with the saddle, while on the other 2 wincing beasts blankets were strapped. 2 bucks, absolutely naked but for their breech clouts, bestride each of the undersized, thin steeds. Entirely disregarding the horse conditions, the party proposed to ride through to Sand Point, for the Indian is quite void of all mercy in regards to animals, and when he wants to get any place, he rides poor brute until it drops. Business took me away for 3 or 4 days, and when I returned, old Dave was just getting back in a canoe, minus the $90 and the 3 horses. The horses and the dollars had been gambled away or expended upon a grand debauch in Sandpoint, where, though it was a criminal offense to supply Indians with whiskey, drunken natives could be seen staggering through the streets almost any day. Occasionally, a white man's life paid the penalty, for whiskey makes the Indian a dangerous customer. But the profits of the business were then, and are still, too great not to attract the scum of the whites. In a lawless country, as Idaho then was, the trade was carried on quite openly. Well, this ends the recording of the Midge and Baillie-Grohman's description of Dave McLaughlin. But I would think that the land that McLaughlin preempted would be where Reichert's and Port Hill are now situated. Baillie-Grohman also had a description of Wild Horse. It reads as follows. In East Kootenay, a country into which whales could be fitted 1.5 times, matters then stood a little differently. It had a short-lived mining boom, but had long subsided into its primeval state. The 11 grisly old-timers who made up the white population, if anything, then the remoteness of Kootenay from civilization. How the one subject of their thoughts, the boom, had come about can be told very briefly. Indians had discovered in 1862 rich diggings in a little gulch penetrating into the western face of the Rockies, here rising from the valley like a giant wall 800 feet high, or 8,000 feet high. A couple of wandering trappers heard of it, and through them the news spread and eventually populated this remote creek, which at first was known as Stud Horse and then as Wild Horse Creek, with the usual seething mass of excited miners. From the nearest settlement, the already mentioned Walla Walla, 500 miles of impenetrable forest separated them. All necessities of life kept at famine prices, flour selling at from $4 to $10 the pound. That must be shillings, yes. From 4 shillings to 10 shillings a pound, and even the simplest mining tools being practically unobtainable. Only very rich claims could under such circumstances pay. Wages being of course very high, $15 a day for the ordinary miner. For a season or 2, hundreds of miners sunk shafts, built flumes to carry water and blasted into the banks and bed of the creek. Only a minority, however, making rich strikes to pay off. Then other distant camps to the north and the south, the Big Ben and Helena, came to the fore. Not long afterwards, Wild Horse was a deserted camp, untidy heaps of tailings, scores of tunnels, and constructed water ditches, and hundreds of prospect holes sunk at likely-looking spots of the creek, with some scores of deserted log shacks telling the pathetic tale of a forsaken mining camp. When the old camp, as in later years it was familiarly called, must have been like in its heyday in the early 60s, no one who has knocked about western placer mines need to be told. For one season it had been a very lively camp, for it was remote from civilization than it was more remote from civilization than any other North America. And the pistol-flourishing cutthroats of California and Montana mining camps flocked hither in full expectation that here at least they would be safe from unpleasant interviews with that terror to their class, Judge Begbie, to whom more than any other man is due the province's fair reputation. Among the lawless parasites that infest every camp, British Columbia was anything but popular. In Wild Horse, these gentry expected to have a high old time, for the nearest jail, police, officer, or magistrate was more than a month's journey off, and the outlawed gamblers, murderers, and out-of-job desperadoes flocked to Kootenay in numbers that boded ill for the camp. But they had counted without Judge O'Reilly, who, accompanied by a single constable, hurried up from the coast to Wild Horse as fast as horses and a canoe would take him, reaching the remote gulch with the first rush of the dangerous element. Assembling as many of the miners as chose to attend in front of the single-room log cabin, which he had turned into a temporary courthouse, while a larger one was being built as fast as liberally expended gold would fell and square logs. Judge Riley made a famous speech which is still remembered throughout the mining camps on the slope. Standing near the pole from which floated the Union Jack, the only symbol of authority to be seen, he said, "Boys, I'm here to keep order and to administer the law. Those who don't want law and order can get, but those who stay with the camp, remember on what side of the line the camp is. For boys, if there's shooting in the Kootenays, there will be hanging in the Kootenays." There was but one murder in Wild Horse, that of Jack Lawson, the constable. An old grave at the trail side near Bonner's Ferry, which I have passed scores of times, and near which, oddly enough, a similar end as Lawson's nearly overtook me, marks the spot where, after 3 weeks' hunt, justice in the shape of rifles in the hand of deputy sheriffs ended the career of the murderer. The Wild Horse boom was, as I have said, but a short one, and in 1882, when I struck the country, the latter had long reverted to conditions almost as primeval as before the rush. Only 11 white settlers lived in the vast East Kootenay district. Most of them were living around the old camp, where some scores of Chinamen who had wandered into Kootenay after the exodus of the white miners were now digging over the old ground and washing the tailings for a second and third time with the tireless diligence of their race. This community of 11 white men was a somewhat unique little settlement, and a more isolated one it would be difficult to imagine. As a relic of the days when the population of this infinitely remote gulch in the heart of the Rockies Mountains had been counted by hundreds, the camp still held its old franchise of returning 2 members to the Provincial House of Parliament, which in 1882 consisted of 24 or 25 members. So evenly matched had been the ins and the outs in provincial politics that neither party had dared to disfranchise Wild Horse. The place also boasted of a gold commissioner who acted as his own constable, returning officer, and registrar, a postmaster who made up and received 4 mails in the year, and who was one of the 2 storekeepers in Kootenay, and a Roman Catholic missionary who was at the head of the primitive little Indian school and mission that had been started many years before by the famous Father de Smet. The 2 white women in the camp had come in during the boom 15 or 20 years before, and had never been out of the camp since. And as they were the wives of the 2 rival storekeepers, they had not even the chance of enjoying each other's company. If I add the 7 of these 11 old-timers were Irishmen, to which nationality also the two women belonged, it will be acknowledged that there was present the elements for a good deal of political fun. To the two legislators, their parliamentary duties were better than a gold mine, for their travelling allowance of 10 cents a mile of the very roundabout route to Victoria amounted to more than did the session allowances of £80, which was attached to the office of MPP, members of the provincial parliament. It was none too much, for a journey to the capital was in those days a formidable undertaking that occupied several weeks, and which meant a horseback ride of some 500 miles over the worst trails imaginable through Idaho and Washington, until the Oregon short line to Portland in Oregon was reached, where a coast steamer could be taken to Victoria. Well, that about ends Baillie-Grohman's description of Wild Horse. But he also writes in his book about the sawmill he had established at Canal Flat, and there's part of that is directly connected with Fort Steele. It reads as follows. It's entitled Running a Sawmill in a Store Up Country. My millwright, though one of the most objectionable Canadian bounders I ever had anything to do with, was a splendid worker, and 10 days after we had unloaded the boiler and machinery at the flats, our small force of 8 men had completed the foundations of the mill out of hand-squared logs, and the first shrill blast of the whistle sounded the death knell from many of the giant yellow pines growing in stately groves within a handy distance from the mill. From that day, boards, lumber they are called in America, flowed freely from that gleaming blade revolving at lightning speed through huge pine logs 3 or 4 feet through. Soon we had the mill housed and had put up some shelter shanties, for winter came early that year, and our flimsy tents were in the habit of collapsing under the pressure of the sleet and snow. Man is born and man dies, and these two principal incidents of our existence, the new sawmill, and insinuated rather oddly. The first slab, which that circle of bright steel sliced from a bulky log, I happened to present to an Indian squaw standing by, in amazement watching this invisible power first drag the great tree, nearly 20 feet long, up to the saw, and then bite its way through as it were so much cheese. She evidently prized the relic, for next day she showed me part of it turned into a cradle, or rather into a papoose board on which babies are strapped for transportation. Death, as we shall see, did not lag far behind the primitive cradle. The police force, which had previously garrisoned a post in the swamps of the Northwest Territory, where mountain fever, which is nothing but a form of typhoid, was a frequent visitor, had brought with them the germs, and soon an epidemic of it was raging in the otherwise extremely healthy Upper Kootenay country. 2 of their men, returning from a long ride to Golden, were suddenly taken ill while resting near our mill. Within a couple of hours they were so bad that I sent one of my men to the headquarters of the force about 50 miles off, where they were erecting a regular post, the present Fort Steele. For the Indian troubles did not promise to be over just yet. The man rode the night through, and next evening one of the police freight wagons, drawn by 4 steaming horses, was back, though not with a doctor, whose assistance was so urgently needed. The sergeant in charge of the conveyance had brought orders to bring the men to the fort, for the doctor had his hands full there and could not possibly leave. And civilian doctor there was none nearer than Donald, 4 days' journey off. I felt very loath to let the sick man leave, for they seemed as bad as they could be, but the sergeant would hear of no delay. So after giving them a strong dose of anodyne, the poor fellows were lifted into the wagon bed, a layer of fir branches which I had placed underneath them, softening a little the jolting in a springless wagon driven at a trot through the woods, over stumps and roots, and through water holes. It was raining heavily at the time, and as the driver had forgotten to bring the canvas wagon cover, the doctor's instructions to the sergeant to bring with him as much inch lumber as he could find room for were acted upon, by lashing a sort of roof over the wagon bed in which the sick man lay. Death is habitually taken in a lighter grain by Western men than it is among more civilized surroundings, where accidents are rare. But nevertheless, the surgeon's reply when I asked him for what purpose these inch boards were required at the fort must have seemed of grim significance to the invalids lying there in plain hearing. "Oh," said the sergeant, "the doc told me that if the men were looking bad, I should bring enough lumber along to bury them with, for they have more dead men than lumber at the fort, and whipsawing ain't healthy this weather." The sergeant wasn't very far off. One of the men we heard was dead when the post was reached, and the other one used up the balance of the lumber a day or two later, as the driver laconically wrote to one of my men. This is the end of the recording.